This screencast is about understanding global namespace pollution. More specifically, what do people mean when they say stop polluting the global namespace when you write JavaScript code? What are some techniques for avoiding it? We'll take a look at that with some real code examples starting now. Let's look at an example of global namespace pollution by writing some plain old JavaScript code. So here I have a page. It's simple, it just has an H1 in it that says just JavaScript example. It has a script.js file here in the footer. The script.js file is currently totally empty. So let's load that page over here in the browser window on the left. And let's take a peek at what keys are hanging at the window object level or in the global namespace right now. So this is a neat trick. Keys is a keyword in the Chrome developer tools. And you can just pass it an object like so, and it will show you all the objects that are sitting up in the global namespace. So your goal here is not with every line of code you write to add something to this window object, but instead to add one or two things to this global context and keep your code organized underneath that. So it's much more synonymous with, you're basically trying to create what would be in .NET or C#, VB.NET, a namespace, or in Java, a package, or in Ruby, a module to organize your code into. You wouldn't just sit here as people do and declare a variable, save the file, and if I reload the page and run that command again, you can see that I'm simply adding more noise to that global namespace, more stuff that can get stomped on in this global context. Let's look at another example. So if I create a function, and this is not uncommon. You create a file, you start writing some functions, but notice if you were doing this in a programming language on the server, you would do this inside a class or a module or something. You wouldn't think of just newing up, or inside a package in Java, you wouldn't think of just newing up a function, but here, you do. And here's what's happening. Test variable is here, and now test function is here. So you can see how this quickly would, this is what people mean when they say you're polluting the global namespace. Right now you're polluting the global namespace. So let's look at some tactics to help you avoid this. So one thing people do is they put all of this inside a function. So let's say you had this code, you create a function, you move all this code inside of here, inside the closure of this function. I won't get into closures deeply, but in other words, the closure is the enclosure of the function. So this stuff is now inside of this function, so it's not scoped any higher. Then there's this concept in JavaScript that's very common called an immediately invoked functional expression. So what you do is you take the function you just wrote and you wrap it with two parens, and then you invoke it with another two parentheses. So now when we do this, we reload the page and we check our window object. Nothing has been added to the global namespace because it's all this test variable and test function are enclosed inside of this closure, and unless you have access to that closure in some way, you can't get to it, but the code can still run. For example, I could call test function right here. Reload the page, and you can see that it output test to the console, but still we don't have anything polluting that global namespace. So that's one tactic of dealing with global namespace pollution. Another common one is to basically create your own namespace by using a variable or a series of variables. So let's, common thing to call it is app or my app. So let's do this. So if I write this, what I'm basically saying is, hey, if my app already exists, my app equals my app in this file, or go ahead and create me a new object literal. And then I'm going to remove this immediately invoked functional expression from the outside, the code I've written. Move the code back over. So now what I can do is start, instead of hanging these things off the global namespace, I can put them in the context of my code, of my namespace, that is. So I'll say .test function equals a function. So now, if we do that, and we check our global namespace and see how it's looking. We have the my app there, and we can look at my app, and it has the test function and the test variable. We can even invoke the test function, but we haven't polluted the global namespace. So that gives you an idea of what global namespace pollution is and some techniques for dealing with it. So now that we understand global namespace pollution, let's look at how some of the frameworks use the techniques I've shown you, as well as others, to combat global namespace pollution. So let's start by pointing out that in this Backbone example application from the book, they use the technique of creating one global variable and kind of putting all their common object definitions and functions inside of that variable. So here's an example. The app variable, you assign the user to it. You'll see in other places, here's a view in that same project. The project's view, the definition of it gets hung off the app view. Here's also an example of where immediately invoked functional expressions take place. So this whole block of code is wrapped in an immediately invoked functional expression. And what you'll notice is a little bit different is this $sign coming into the immediately invoked functional expression. So what's going on there is that's referred to as an import to the immediately invoked functional expression. And basically what's happening is jQuery is in this page and available. It's being passed in and aliased as $sign inside of here. So then we're absolutely sure that inside this immediately invoked functional expression that document.ready will have run if we wrap this in a document ready, and that the value of $ will refer to jQuery. So let's look at at AngularJS application and how it combats global namespace pollution. So I have an app over here on the left that simply allows you to edit surveys. Play with it for a second here. So you can kind of get a feel for how it works. Just a simple CRUD app with one field. I have two versions of the controllers file. So if we look at the index file here, currently we're using controllers global. And what's going on in here is, so here we do create a global variable and configure our router off of that global variable. But our controllers are not using that global variable. They're currently just functions created, like this new controller is one controller, the edit controller's here, but they're put out there on the global namespace. And we can see that if we check the Windows object, we can see the new controller, the edit controller, list controller are all polluting the global namespace. If, however, we were to go back to this index page and set this to controllers.js, which is the default file, and take a look, we'll see that the global namespace is no longer polluted. Everything's underneath this survey app. That's because AngularJS has this feature called modules, which basically creates a namespace for you to use, in this case survey app, for the rest of the objects in your app. So the route configuration goes inside of there. The new controller goes inside a survey app. The controller, the edit controller, all the controllers sort of get namespaced inside this survey app variable called the module in AngularJS. So now we've kind of come full circle and seen how the frameworks use these same tactics to combat polluting the global namespace and keep your writing clean and organized JavaScript code.